The UK economy is in genuinely horrible shape, and almost nobody in Westminster wants to talk about why. On paper, Britain is the sixth largest economy in the world. In practice, the average person is poorer than someone living in Mississippi. If you take London out of the equation, the country's GDP per person drops by 14% overnight. This isn't a wealthy nation with a few rough patches. This is a country that's quietly become two economies stapled together, and only one of them is working. Let's start with the basic paradox. Imagine taking London off the map. Just delete the city and its surrounding region from the UK entirely. What's left is a country where GDP per person drops by 14% overnight. That's not a minor adjustment. That's the difference between being a wealthy country and being, well, roughly on par with Slovenia. And this matters because when politicians talk about Britain's economy, they're almost always talking about London's economy. The financial services boom, the tech startups, the Premier League rights deals, those numbers are real, but they describe a tiny slice of the country. For the other 50-odd million people who don't live within commuting distance of the city, the UK has been running a very different experiment for the last 40 years. Call it the Great Economic Lopsiding. The roots of it go back to 1979, specifically to a woman named Margaret Thatcher and a decision that would reshape the country permanently. When Thatcher took power, Britain was already in trouble. Inflation was spiraling, unemployment was climbing, and the old industrial base, coal mining, steel, shipbuilding, textiles, was struggling to compete with cheaper overseas production. Something needed to change. The question was what? And the answer Thatcher chose was finance. In 1986, her government launched something called the Big Bang, a sweeping deregulation of London's financial markets that transformed the city almost overnight. Fixed commissions were scrapped, exchange controls ended, foreign ownership was welcomed, electronic trading was unleashed. Within a few years, international banks had poured nearly £500 million into the square mile. The UK's service sector jumped from 22% of GDP to over 70% by the 2000s. For London, the gains were genuinely historic. Property values exploded, wages surged, new restaurants, new infrastructure, new status. The city became a global financial hub almost immediately and has remained one ever since. For the rest of the country, the story was somewhat less triumphant. Actually, that's being generous. The rest of the country basically speedran a 30-year decline. Manufacturing went from around 30% of GDP to just 16% in a single decade. Manufacturing employment collapsed from over 7 million jobs to just over 4 million between 1980 and 1990. And these weren't unskilled positions. Many required a decade of training, but they couldn't compete with cheaper overseas alternatives, and the new service economy that was supposed to replace them simply wasn't located anywhere near the towns that needed it. By the 1990s, the Southeast alone held 5 times more high-paying service sector jobs than the entire north of England combined. That gap has been widening ever since. This is the first thing to understand about Britain's economic situation. It isn't one country with one economy, it's two, and they're pulling further apart every decade. The numbers are stark. Today, not a single region in the UK north of London has a GDP per person higher than the UK average. Not one. Every single region outside London and the southeast is, by definition, poorer than the national mean. That's mathematically obvious only because the national mean is being dragged upwards so heavily by one specific geographic area. But it still tells you something important about how British wealth actually works. It's concentrated, ruthlessly. And the concentration isn't just geographic, it's also generational. Home ownership among 25 to 34-year-olds has dropped from 59% in 2000 to just 28% in 2023. That's not a gradual shift, that's a collapse. An entire generation has been effectively priced out of the wealth-building mechanism their parents took for granted. Quick pause. Subscribe, it's free, unlike almost everything else in the UK economy right now. But the regional gap and the generational gap are only two of Britain's economic absurdities. The third one is productivity, and this is where things get really uncomfortable. Before 2008, UK productivity was growing at around 2% a year. Modest, steady, but enough to drive rising wages and improving living standards. After the financial crash, something broke. Productivity growth didn't just slow, it flatlined. For more than 15 years, the UK has been operating at what economists call the productivity puzzle, which is the polite way of saying nobody fully understands why the country basically hit pause on economic growth and forgot to press play again. Today, Britain ranks in the bottom 10% of OECD countries for productivity. Workers in Germany, France, and the United States produce significantly more value per hour than UK workers. That isn't because British workers are lazy, it's because British workers are using older equipment in older buildings, trained through older systems, supported by older infrastructure. Since 2005, British companies have invested roughly 20% less than their counterparts in comparable economies. The country literally hasn't been spending enough on the tools and training that make workers productive. And when productivity doesn't rise, wages don't rise, which is exactly what's happened. British wages are now lower in real terms than they were in 2008. That's 15 years of working more and getting less. So that's the economic picture. A country where the wealth concentrates in one city, where an entire generation is locked out of the property ladder, where productivity has been dead for over a decade, where wages have been flat for longer than some of the people watching this have been alive. The obvious question is, why nobody fixes this? And the answer, which is politically uncomfortable for everyone, is that the people with the power to fix it aren't really affected by it. If you're a senior politician, a newspaper editor, a financial executive, or a senior civil servant, you almost certainly live in or near London. You benefit from the wage premium, the property wealth, and the services that concentrate in the southeast. The problems that plague the rest of the country, decaying town centres, collapsing bus routes, closing libraries, stagnant wages, happen somewhere you don't go and don't personally experience. This is why every government for the past 15 years has announced an identical sounding plan. The Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine. Levelling up, different names, same premise. We're going to rebalance the economy, and every time the money mysteriously ends up flowing toward London anyway. HS2 was meant to connect the north to London. The northern legs got cancelled. Crossrail was meant to be followed by Crossrail 2 and a similar project in the north, only the London version happened. It's not that the regions are being actively sabotaged, it's more that when push comes to shove, political power lives where the money is, and the money lives in London. So when there's a choice about where to spend £1 billion, the £1 billion goes to the place that's already richest, because that's where the decision makers live. This is the honest story of the British economy in 2026. It's not that the UK is poor, the country generates an enormous amount of wealth. It's that the wealth flows, increasingly, in one direction. Upward, southward, and away from the people who actually need it. For most of the population, the economy they live in has been essentially stagnant for a decade and a half. For London, the economy has never been more dynamic. These two things are both true at the same time, and pretending otherwise, which is roughly what every major political party has been doing, just makes the problem bigger. The fix isn't mysterious. Other countries have done it. Germany spreads its economic activity across Munich, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Berlin. France has actively moved government functions out of Paris to smaller cities. The Netherlands has made a deliberate point of investing in regional infrastructure. None of these countries is perfect, but none of them is quite as lopsided as Britain has allowed itself to become. The question isn't whether the UK economy is broken. The numbers already answered that. The question is whether the country still has the political will to build an economy that works for more than one city.